The walls creaked with the weight of the storm, and the ceiling above me groaned, as if the house itself was tired of holding on. I stayed curled under the thin blanket, listening to the steady drip into the bowl I had placed on the table. The sound was almost hypnotic, a metronome to the loneliness pressing down on me. My father had been gone only hours. My mother even less, yet it already felt as if years had passed since anyone had looked at me with love. I tried closing my eyes, but every time I did, I saw those red taillights fading away, the way Mark's hand rested on her back, as if she belonged to him. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, shame mixed with anger, though I didn't yet have words sharp enough to describe it. At 13, I still thought family was permanent, that blood was stronger than convenience, and it rattled me to realize how quickly someone could walk away. The wind rattled the porch screen, and for a moment I feared Officer Daniels might return to check if I was lying. I slid the card he had given me under my pillow, as if hiding it could erase the danger. I imagined foster parents' strange bedrooms, other children who would laugh at my second-hand shoes and quiet voice. That fear alone kept me rooted to the rotten floorboards of this house. I forced myself to get up and move through the rooms. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and grease. On the counter sat the jar of money, pathetic in its smallness. $40. Enough for a couple days of groceries if I stretched it, but I already knew Mom had not thought that far ahead. She had left me not with a plan, but with scraps. The refrigerator hummed, and I opened it to find half a loaf of bread, a jar of pickles, and a carton of milk that had expired last week. I made myself eat a dry slice of bread anyway. It stuck in my throat, but chewing gave me something to do besides listen to the rain. When I walked back into the living room, the lamp in the corner flickered. I tapped it until the light steadied, casting long shadows across the faded carpet. I remembered Dad's boots there, the heavy ones caked with mud, after long shifts at the base. I remembered how Mom used to complain about the smell wrinkling her nose while Dad laughed and pulled her close. Thinking of that laughter now felt like thinking of a foreign country, one I could never return to. I found myself wandering into her bedroom. The closet doors were half-open gaps on the shelves where her clothes had been. The dresser drawers hung open too, emptied in a rush. Only a broken hairbrush remained, teeth missing a few strands of blonde tangled in the bristles. I picked it up and stared. It was proof she had once lived here, proof that my memory was not playing tricks. But proof was cold comfort. I set it down and whispered into the air. Why wasn't I enough? The rain slowed outside, and for a while the house fell still. I decided to move my things closer to the back door. If Officer Daniels came back, I could pretend my grandmother really was arriving soon. I stacked my school books neatly, though there was no one to check my homework anymore. Math worksheets, history, notes all suddenly meaningless. My pencil case rattled with the last sharpener blade. I gripped it hard, telling myself these tools were weapons, now not for fighting others, but for holding on to the boy I used to be. Sleep came in fragments. I woke often thinking I heard footsteps, only to realize it was just water dripping in the kitchen sink. At dawn, the sky turned gray, and the neighborhood dogs barked at nothing. I rose stiffly from the floor, cold in my bones, and opened the front curtains. Across the street, Mrs. Palmer was pulling weeds from her flower bed. She glanced up, her eyes squinting at the sight of me. I stepped back before she could wave. The last thing I wanted was pity. I decided to check the mailbox more out of habit than hope. Inside was a single envelope addressed to Mom. The logo of a military credit union stamped the corner. My pulse jumped. I knew these letters carried money the pay Dad had been sending home. I imagined her sliding these checks into her purse, smiling at Mark, never thinking of me. Rage and fear tangled together inside me. I shoved the envelope back and slammed the box shut before Mrs. Palmer could notice. Back inside, I took the $40 from the jar and counted it slowly. 4 tens, all creased and worn. I pressed them flat on the table and decided I would not spend them unless I had to. Dad had always told me to treat money with respect, because money had a way of walking out the door if you didn't hold it tight. Now I knew people could do the same. By mid-morning, the hunger gnawed at me again. I poured a glass of sour milk, gagged, and poured it down the drain. The bread was gone. I opened the pantry and found nothing but flour hardened in a bag and a box of crackers crawling with ants. My hands trembled as I crushed the box and threw it out the back door. I went upstairs thinking maybe I would find something Mom had forgotten. The attic hatch groaned as I pulled it open. Dust spilled down, and the smell of mothballs filled my nose. I climbed the narrow ladder into the gloom. There beneath a tarp sat a wooden box carved with initials I recognized as my grandmother Rose's. My heart leapt. I dragged it into the light, brushed the dust away and pried it open. Inside were photographs brittle with age showing Dad as a boy, Mom on their wedding day, and me as a baby in Rose's arms. Beneath the photos was a sealed envelope. My fingers shook as I opened it and found a passbook for a savings account. The balance read $1,200. I sat back on my heels, stunned. To me it was a fortune. Enough to buy food, maybe to keep the lights on, maybe even more if I learned how to use it wisely. There was also a letter written in Rose's looping hand. Ethan, if you find this, it means times are hard. Go to the credit union, ask for Mrs. Ellison. She will know what to do. I pressed the paper to my chest and felt warmth for the first time since the airport. The world had not completely abandoned me. My grandmother, though frail and distant, had thought ahead, had left me something to hold on to. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I tucked the passbook back into the box, closed it carefully, and carried it down the ladder. The weight felt heavier than gold. I placed it beneath my mattress, where Officer Daniels would not find it if he returned. The rest of the day blurred. I cleaned the kitchen, stacked dishes, swept crumbs from the floor, not because anyone cared, but because order gave me strength. Every few minutes I checked the street through the curtains, watching for my mother's car, though deep down I knew it would never come. As evening approached, the clouds cleared, and the setting sun cut through the windows in sharp angles. The house glowed briefly, as if remembering what it was like to be alive. I sat on the floor with the blanket wrapped around me, staring at the officer's card, still tucked beneath the jar of bills. If I dialed the number, my life would be decided by strangers. If I stayed silent, survival would be on me. I chose silence. The first night alone had ended with fear. The second would begin with a plan. I whispered to the walls that I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me break. And as the light faded, I held the image of my father's hand on my shoulder, the last solid thing I had, and I let it carry me into another uncertain night. Morning arrived as a thin light that bled through the torn curtains and found every crack in the paint. I sat up with the blanket around my shoulders and listened to the house settling after the storm. Somewhere a pipe knocked. Somewhere a squirrel ran the length of the roof and made the shingles click. I waited for the courage to move. When it came, it felt small and stubborn, like a pilot light that had survived the wind. I washed my face at the kitchen sink with water that ran rust brown for a moment, then cleared. The mirror over the stove was a warped square, the kind you stick up with glue. It threw back a boy with hollowed eyes and rain frizz in his hair. I told that boy that we were still here. I told him that still here counted. Food had to come first. I opened every cabinet again, then the drawer with the loose utensils, then the space under the sink, just in case something had rolled there and been forgotten. Nothing but an old sponge and a single packet of salt in a takeout envelope. I slid the jar of $40 toward me and counted the bills with careful fingers. 4 tens creased and soft to stack that looked smaller the longer I stared at it. I put one in my pocket and left the other 3 under the officer's card, as if the card itself were a paperweight that could keep the money from flying away. Outside, the air smelled like wet leaves and gasoline. The neighborhood was awake and trying not to look in my direction. Mr. Barlow across the street lifted a cooler into the back of his truck. The Palmer dog barked at a jogger who did not break stride. I kept my head down and walked 2 blocks to a small corner store with faded signs in the window. Inside it was warm and smelled like coffee and bleach. A short radio on the counter whispered baseball scores. The clerk scanned me in a slow way that said he was adding up all the things I was not saying. I set a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter on the counter. I asked for the cheapest kind. He told me the price and I slid one of my tens across and kept my eyes on his hands when he counted the change. He asked if I wanted a bag, and I told him no. On my way out, he said, "Take care now, kid," and I nodded without looking back. I ate at the kitchen table with the peanut butter spread thick because I could not tell when the next meal would happen. 2 slices of bread and a glass of tap water, and my body went warm for the first time since the airport. After I took the passbook out from under the mattress and opened it again, as if the numbers might have changed in the night. 1,200. I traced the digits with my thumb and then put the book back where it lived. I did not want to leave fingerprints of panic on it. The plan came together in pieces. Monday I would go to the credit union. The letter in the wooden box said, "Find Mrs. Ellison and ask for help. Ask for." It did not say how to explain myself without saying the truth. I tried out sentences in the quiet. My grandmother Rose asked me to bring this in. She is resting and will come later. My father is deployed and my mother is visiting her sister. Each version tasted like chalk. I decided I would not say more than necessary. I would hold the passbook like a shield and let the paper speak. The day stretched long. I needed to make the house look lived in. I swept the front steps and piled the wet leaves in a corner. I dragged the trash can to the curb, even though there was almost nothing inside. I brought in the mail and tucked everything with my mother's name into a drawer I no longer cared to respect. When I passed the mailbox again, I felt the weight of the envelope with the credit union logo and wished I had not seen it at all. Knowing the money had come and gone in someone else's hands made the space under my ribs feel scraped raw. By afternoon, the clouds were back. I went looking for batteries in the drawer with the rubber bands and dead pens. A flashlight rolled to the back when I reached for it, and I had to lie on my stomach and stretch my arm into a dusty gap to catch it. When I clicked it on, it gave a thin ring of light and then died. I shook it, and it flickered. I told myself that it would be enough to get me through the attic if the power went out. The power went out at dusk. It happened with a small sigh from the refrigerator and the lamp blinking twice like a person who has been told a bad joke. The house fell into a softer dark that made edges blur and rooms feel deeper. I stood very still and waited to see if it would come back. It did not. I found the flashlight by feel and coaxed it into a weak beam and climbed the attic ladder again. Up there the air was dry and tasted like old wood. The wooden box waited in the corner like a patient animal. I knelt beside it and lifted the lid. I had looked at the passbook already, but now I took time with the photographs. My father at 12 with a buzz cut and a scab on his knee. My mother in a sundress on a picnic blanket, looking into a distance I could not see. My grandmother Rose in a kitchen with flour on her hands and laughter in her eyes. I arranged them on the floor and tried to build a story that ended somewhere other than here. Beneath the photos, there was a smaller envelope I had missed. Inside was an index card with a phone number and the name written in Rose's careful hand. Mrs. Ellison, Dayton Teachers Credit Union. Ask for the youth account policy. The words steadied me. This was not luck. This was planning. This was my grandmother saying, "I knew you might need more than comfort." I stayed in the attic until my knees ached. When I climbed down, the beam from the flashlight began to sputter. I moved slowly through the house and found the candles in a shoebox my mother kept for power cuts. A little triumph sparked when I struck the first match. The candle flame trembled and grew, and the kitchen became a smaller, kinder place. I ate another slice of bread with peanut butter and rationed the slices in my head. I had counted 10 left. If I ate 2 a day, the loaf would last until Monday. Night deepened, and the house made new noises. Rain started again, softer, as if tired of shouting. I checked the back door and wedged a chair under the knob. I brought the wooden box downstairs and slid it under the couch where I could reach it quickly. I set the passbook under my pillow because superstition had a way of feeling like strategy when you were alone. For a long time, I lay with my eyes open. I counted my breaths. I counted the seconds between drips in the kitchen leak. I did anything that felt like counting because counting made chaos smaller. Sleep pulled me under and pushed me up again in jerks. In one dream, my father was at the end of the airport corridor, still kneeling, still telling me to look after Mom, and I kept trying to run toward him, but the floor moved like a treadmill, and I stayed in place. I woke with my heart hammering and the candle almost out. I pinched the wick between wet fingers and tasted smoke on my tongue. Morning was clearer than the one before. The lights came back with a low hum, and the refrigerator shuddered awake. I opened it and threw out the milk. The smell made my stomach turn. I tied the bag and walked it out to the curb. Mrs. Palmer looked up from her flower bed again. She asked if everything was all right over there. I told her we had a power cut, and then added that my grandmother had stayed the night. The lie felt like a pebble in my shoe, but I kept walking. Saturday moved in slow frames. I cleaned more than necessary. I made a list on a sheet torn from a notebook, small goals that would give the days a skeleton. Food credit union call from Dad. If he can stay off the radar, do homework. Check attic change bucket under leak. I copied the number on Rose's card twice in case I lost one copy. I folded the passbook in a handkerchief so it would not get smudged. By Sunday afternoon, the fear shifted shape. It was not the sharp kind anymore. It was a low ache that hummed behind my ribs. I sat at the kitchen table and practiced what I would say at the credit union. Good morning, I need to speak with Mrs. Ellison. My grandmother Rose asked me to bring this passbook. She is unwell. We need to understand how to access and protect this account. I would keep my voice even. I would hold eye contact. I would be the kind of boy adults did not worry about. I laid out clothes for Monday that made me look older. The least wrinkled shirt I owned. Jeans that had not yet frayed at the cuffs. I found my father's old watch at the back of a drawer. It had a cracked face, and it did not keep time anymore, but the weight of it on my wrist made me feel anchored. I put 2 tens in my pocket and left the other 2 under the officer's card. If something went wrong, I needed to be able to get home. That night the power stayed on, but I lit a candle anyway. I liked the way the flame made the room look warmer. I ate 1 slice of bread and saved the last 3 for Monday and Tuesday. I wrote a note to myself and placed it on top of the wooden box. Go early. Ask for Mrs. Ellison. Keep calm. Tell the smallest possible truth. Before bed, I stood at the front window and watched the street. A couple walked their beagle past our mailbox and laughed at something I could not hear. A teenager biked by with a backpack slung low. The neighborhood looked normal in the way a stage looks normal from the cheap seats. I placed my palm on the glass and felt the night cool against my skin. Then I lay down with the passbook under my pillow and the officer's card under the jar of money, and let the dark come without a fight. I woke before the alarm I did not have. The sky was pale, and the birds were loud in the big maple by the curb. I washed, dressed, combed my hair with my fingers, and put on the watch that did not tick. I tucked the letter and the index card into my pocket with the 2 bills. I locked the door behind me and felt the small click in my bones. The walk to the bus stop was 3 blocks. The bus smelled like raincoats and old gum. I sat near the back and held the passbook inside my jacket, as if anyone could see through fabric. Downtown Dayton in the early hour was a quiet grid of brick and glass. The credit union sat on a corner with a flag out front and a planter of tired petunias. I stood on the steps and read the hours printed on the glass. The minutes until opening felt both heavy and thin. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth and counted to 10, then to 20, then started over. When the lights inside clicked brighter and a woman with gray hair and a calm walk unlocked the door, I straightened my shoulders and stepped forward, feeling the small edge of courage sharpen as I crossed the threshold. The glass doors closed behind me, and the smell of carpet cleaner and printer ink settled around me like a reminder that this was no longer my world of dripping ceilings and peanut butter dinners. The woman with gray hair gave me a polite smile and asked what I needed. My mouth felt dry, but I managed to say, I was here to see Mrs. Ellison. She looked at the passbook in my hand and nodded, leading me past cubicles that hummed with fluorescent light. When we reached a small office, another woman waited, her hair pinned neatly, glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. She stood and shook my hand like I was older than 13. She read the letter from Rose in silence, then the passbook, and finally looked at me. "You must be Ethan. Your grandmother told me one day you might come." Relief and fear crashed together inside me. She explained the account, the balance, the rules. She told me that as long as I was careful, the money could help with groceries, school supplies, maybe more. I nodded and forced my voice steady when I promised I would use it wisely. When I left, the sun on the sidewalk felt sharper than before, and I clutched the small envelope she gave me as if it were a lifeline. That summer became a rhythm of survival. Rose visited often, carrying grocery bags and pretending it was nothing. She taught me how to write emails so I could send messages to Dad overseas, though most came back unread, blocked by deployment silence. She showed me how to keep receipts, how to stack bills in order, how to file away letters. Sometimes she would leave notes in her looping handwriting, tucked into cookbooks or taped under the kitchen sink, small instructions for a boy pretending to be a man. Officer Daniels knocked once a month, always with the same concerned eyes, always asking if everything was all right. I would tell him Rose was around, and he would study my face as if weighing truth against duty. Each visit left me shaken. I feared the moment he would stop believing me. When his patrol car finally drove away, the tension drained out of my body like air from a punctured tire. Years pressed forward. By 2015, I had grown taller, my voice unsteady in ways that had nothing to do with fear. I worked odd jobs, mowing lawns and sweeping garages, slipping cash into the jar with the tens. Rose kept track of what I earned and made me write every amount on lined paper. "You must never let anyone think you are helpless," she said once while we shelled beans on her porch. Her eyes were sharp, even when her hands trembled. The house aged faster than I did. The leaks grew worse, the plaster crumbled, and the stove flickered out for good. I learned to heat canned soup on a hot plate and read by flashlight when the power company shut us off for late payments. Through it all, the passbook lived under my pillow, the last piece of proof that someone had once believed in me. In late 2016, a letter arrived from the Department of Defense addressed to my mother. Curiosity pushed me to tear it open. Inside were statements of payments sent faithfully each month from Afghanistan. My chest went hollow as I realized the truth. She had been collecting the checks, every single one, cashing them without leaving a trace for me. The money that was meant to keep me fed had gone to Mark, to their life somewhere else. Rage burned in me hotter than hunger ever had. I slammed the letter onto the table and stared at it until the words blurred. That night I swore I would never forgive her. By the time 2017 came, Rose's visits grew less frequent. Her steps slowed, her hands shook more, but she still left notes. One February morning, I walked to her apartment and found a neighbor waiting by the door. He told me she had passed in her sleep. The world tilted sideways. At the funeral, small and quiet, I was handed a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was $3,500 and a brass key. The note said the key opened a safe deposit box at the same credit union, and inside I would find the papers I might one day need. I waited a week before going. When I finally opened the box, the contents stopped my breath. There were documents signed and stamped that transferred guardianship of me to Linda. In the margins were amendments giving Mark access to the funds meant for my father's family. Proof. Proof that my abandonment had been written into law, handed over like unwanted furniture. My mother had not simply left. She had erased me with signatures. I walked out of the bank, clutching the key, the papers, and the last envelope of cash Rose had left. The spring air tasted bitter. I realized the house I had stayed in for 4 years was not a home, but a cage, and the only way out was forward. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, spread out the SAT prep book I had borrowed from the library, and opened to the first page. My fingers trembled as I held the pencil. The hunger that had once taught me discipline now taught me something else: that survival was not enough. I needed to prove myself in a language the world respected. I needed scholarships, a way out, a way up. I traced the words on the page until they steadied, and in the silence of the abandoned house, I began to write, building a future word by word, question by question, until exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke hours later, the book was still open, the pencil rolled to the floor. The house was still broken, the leaks still dripping, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time since that night in 2013, I felt the shape of a path. It was narrow and it was steep, but it was mine. By the fall of 2018, I was walking across the campus of Ohio State with a backpack that carried more than books. It carried the proof that I had made it out. The scholarship letter still lived in the bottom pocket, creased from folding and refolding, a silent reminder that my nights under a leaking roof had not been for nothing. The dorm smelled like paint and laundry detergent, and the chatter in the hallways was loud enough to drown out thoughts I was not ready to face. My roommate Tom Harris was the first person who asked questions without pity. He came from Cleveland with a loud laugh and a habit of tossing his shoes under the bed without looking. When I told him I was from Dayton, he asked about my family, and I gave him the shortened version. Dad overseas, Mom gone raised by my grandmother. He studied me for a moment and then just nodded. Later, over pizza cartons and energy drinks, he said sometimes surviving is enough. It was the closest thing to comfort I had heard in years. The job at the IT help desk came quickly. I sat in a basement office under humming lights, answering calls about forgotten passwords and broken printers. The pay was small but steady. Each paycheck I split 3 ways: rent, food, savings. Every time I deposited something into my account, I felt like I was building bricks on top of the path I had promised myself. Classes were another kind of battle. Computer science felt like both a language and a puzzle, familiar but endless. I stayed in the library until the security guards yawned their way through closing rounds. Tom teased me about living on coffee and flashcards, but he also dragged me to the student startup fair in the spring. "You have to show people what you build," he said, "or you'll spend your life fixing someone else's broken printer." I hesitated, but by then I had been working on something. A small encryption program, more of an experiment than a product designed to lock files behind multiple shifting keys. I had built it in pieces during late nights, inspired by the feeling that secrets had always controlled my life, and maybe I could turn that into power. The code was clumsy, but it worked. Tom convinced me to put together a crude demo and sign up for a table. The fair took place in the Student Union rows of folding tables, draped with banners, the air heavy with ambition, and free coffee. Teams wore matching shirts, pitched apps that promised to change the world, and handed out glossy flyers. I had nothing but my laptop, a stack of hastily printed sheets, and the hope that someone might look twice. Hours passed with students drifting by, nodding politely, asking if my program was for a class project. A professor glanced at my screen and said the concept was interesting, but nothing new. A group of seniors laughed openly at the design. Each dismissal landed sharp, but I kept smiling, repeating the explanation as if words could armor me. By mid-afternoon, my throat was raw and my hands trembled each time I restarted the demo. Tom tried to draw people in with his easy charm, but most moved toward the flashier booths with polished logos and catered snacks. I felt smaller with every glance past my table, every polite smile that dismissed me. The path I had felt beneath my feet months ago seemed to crumble stone by stone. Near the end of the day, a tall man in a blazer paused at my table. He was not a student, not a professor. He studied the screen longer than anyone else had. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quiet under the chatter. "Ethan Walker," I said, and waited for the dismissal. Instead, he pulled out a card and placed it on the table. "David Miller, Associate Hudson Venture Partners, New York." He told me the idea was raw, but the instinct was strong. He said the world needed better ways to guard its information, and sometimes the smallest sparks grew into something that mattered. Then he nodded once as if he had seen enough and walked away into the crowd. I stared at the card until the edges blurred the name burning itself into my memory. Tom slapped me on the shoulder, grinning like it was a victory, but I could not feel triumph. All I felt was the echo of every laugh, every dismissive glance, every reminder that I was still the boy from the abandoned house pretending to belong. The card sat heavy in my pocket, both promise and taunt. When the fair closed, I packed up my laptop and flyers that no one wanted. I walked back across campus under the weight of failure pressed against the faint spark of possibility. In my dorm room, I set the card on the desk and stared at it, while the night filled with the sounds of laughter and music from the street below. I told myself I had not come this far to fold at the first sign of rejection. But the sting of being overlooked clung to me sharper than hunger had ever been. I lay down with the card still on the desk, the glow from the streetlight catching the letters of his name, and let exhaustion take me into a restless sleep. The spring thaw of 2019 came with a decision I could no longer put off. I filed the paperwork to defer my scholarship, stuffed my few belongings into a duffel bag, and boarded a bus bound for New York City. The ride smelled of fast food wrappers and stale coffee, but my chest buzzed with the stubborn belief that the skyline waiting at the end would be my proving ground. When the bus pulled into Port Authority, and I stepped onto the streets of Manhattan, the noise and the smell of exhaust hit me all at once. I found a room in Queens through a listing tacked on a community board. The place was barely more than a closet, with walls that shuddered whenever the subway passed, but it was cheap enough. I bought packets of instant noodles by the dozen, stacked them like bricks under my bed, and lived on them. At night I coded until my fingers cramped, hunched over a thrift store desk with a second-hand laptop that wheezed with every compile. David Miller's card stayed tucked inside my wallet like a charm, though I had not spoken to him since the student fair. Weeks later I gathered the nerve to send an email. To my surprise, he replied. "Meet me at a cafe in Midtown," he wrote. I dressed in the cleanest shirt I owned and walked through the city like a soldier heading to battle. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and cheap pastries. David was already there, sleek in a gray suit, scrolling on his phone. When he finally looked up, his eyes were polite but distant. I launched into my pitch too quickly, words spilling out in a rush, talking about algorithms and key rotations. His face stayed neutral. I realized too late that I had built the pitch for a professor, not a venture capitalist. When I finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "My idea had no market. Come back when you have customers." Then he stood, shook my hand without warmth, and left. I sat in that cafe long after my coffee went cold. My ears rang with the sting of rejection. By the time I walked back to Queens, I felt stripped bare. I told myself it was just one meeting, but in the small room with the peeling paint, I lay awake wondering if I had dragged myself to New York just to fail louder. Weeks later, I scraped together the courage to pitch at an angel networking event. I stood in front of a circle of strangers in a borrowed blazer, my voice cracking as I explained what I had built. When I finished, silence hung heavy before someone finally chuckled. "Dayton boy wants to fix cybersecurity," one of them said, and the room erupted in laughter. My face burned as if every secret of mine had been exposed. I shook hands, nodded, and walked out into the night air, my stomach turning. That failure left a mark deeper than hunger or cold ever had. I spent the next morning staring at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, asking if maybe I was destined to be invisible. But something inside me resisted. I packed my notebook, walked into the city, and began knocking on doors. I asked shop owners, baristas, small restaurateurs, what kept them up at night about their businesses. Most ignored me, some brushed me off, but a few answered. They talked about stolen data, stolen password systems they did not trust. I filled pages with notes, sketches, ideas. Each conversation added flesh to a product I had once thought was just a skeleton. It was in one of those conversations that I met Sarah Thompson. She was sitting at a corner table in a Brooklyn cafe, legal pad, open glasses perched low on her nose. She had been listening while I stumbled through my questions to the owner. When I left, she followed me outside. "You're building something, aren't you?" she said. I nodded, cautious. She introduced herself as an attorney, said she had worked with startups. Then she looked at me with the kind of seriousness that made me straighten my shoulders. "If you want anyone to take you seriously, you need to set up a Delaware C Corp. Otherwise, you're just another kid with a laptop." Her words landed heavier than any insult at the networking event. They were not dismissal, but instruction. She scribbled her number on the corner of a receipt and handed it to me. "Call me when you are ready." Then she disappeared into the crowd of the street, leaving me staring at the paper in my hand. That night, I boiled another packet of noodles, steam clouding the tiny window. I thought about how quickly people had laughed, how quickly they had looked away, and how different her eyes had been. I taped the receipt to the wall above my desk, just beside the card from David Miller. 2 names, 2 directions, one telling me to come back with customers, the other telling me to build a real foundation. The city hummed outside, sirens wailing, footsteps echoing on the pavement. I bent over my laptop again, code filling the screen, fingers moving slower now, not with desperation, but with resolve. Failure had cost me my pride, but it had also given me a map. I wrote until dawn lit the edge of the blinds, until my body ached, and when I finally leaned back, I knew this was only the beginning of a longer war. The radiator hissed, the subway roared, and I sat in that small room in Queens with a half-empty notebook and 2 pieces of paper pinned to the wall. The laughter of strangers still stung in my ears, but the sting had sharpened into something else, something closer to fire. By the start of 2021, Sentinel Tech was no longer just a name on a piece of paper. It lived in an office above a laundromat in Long Island City, with rows of mismatched desks and the hum of 8 people who believed in the same thing I did. We had gone from a few $100s trickling in to $35,000 every month. Each new customer contract felt like another nail in the coffin of the boy who once rationed peanut butter sandwiches. When the seed round of $500,000 closed, I walked home in the cold January air with a grin I could not shake. 6 months later, when the Series A wire hit for $5 million, I stared at the number in my account until my eyes blurred. The city outside kept moving, but for me, time had stopped. Hiring those first 8 people was both terrifying and electric. They were young, hungry, reckless in the way I once was, and each brought a piece I did not have. We signed a contract with a mid-sized healthcare firm in New Jersey, and I remember the feeling of sliding the signed papers into the drawer. I had proof now that my work mattered, that someone outside of my own stubborn heart believed in it enough to pay. The night we launched version 2 of our platform is burned into me. The office lights buzzed, empty takeout boxes stacked high, and my team's faces glowed pale in the monitor light. At midnight, the servers buckled. Panic rippled like a current. Fingers flew across keyboards, voices clipped, hearts racing. For a moment, I saw everything collapse: the company, the faith, the years. Then something shifted. They rallied, patched, rerouted. I shouted instructions until my voice cracked, and when the graphs steadied and the servers held, the room erupted in cheers. I sank into my chair, sweat soaking through my shirt, and laughed until my chest hurt. Outside of work, the city moved in a different rhythm. It was at a lecture at Columbia that I met Claire Donovan. She stood at the edge of the hall with a notebook under her arm, her red hair catching the light in a way that made the room blur. We started with coffee, then walks through Riverside Park conversations that lasted until the streetlights buzzed on. She asked about my childhood, my family, and I gave her fragments. A father in the military, a grandmother who meant the world's silence about the rest. She never pressed, but I could see the question in her eyes. I told myself that building a company required secrets, that my past was a burden she did not need to carry. So I spoke of code of clients, of the way the city looked from the roof of our office at night. She smiled, and for a while that was enough. Yet every time her hand brushed mine, I felt the weight of what I was hiding. The office grew louder, busier, stacks of contracts on my desk, investors calling at all hours. I found myself split between 2 lives, one with a team that looked to me as if I carried all the answers, and another with a woman whose laugh made me forget the sharp edges of my past. In both, I played the role expected of me: the founder, the fighter, the man who had clawed his way out of shadows. There were nights I sat alone after the team had gone, staring at the city skyline through the grimy windows. The numbers told me we were winning, that survival had turned into success. But beneath it all lingered the memory of Dayton, the abandoned house, the checks stolen by a woman who shared my blood. No investor pitch or product launch could erase that. It sat in me like a stone, shaping every word I said, every decision I made. When Claire asked if I ever thought about going back to Ohio, I shook my head too quickly. The truth was, I had thought of nothing else. I dreamed of walking into that town, not as the forgotten child, but as someone untouchable. Yet I swallowed it down, told her my life was here, that the past was better left buried. She looked at me for a long time, then let the silence settle. The company hit milestones faster than I could process. Revenue climbed, our client list stretched across states, and the office that once shook with the subway below now shook with laughter and late-night victories. Still, in quiet moments when the city slept, I wondered if success built on fire could ever burn clean. On a cold night in December, after another contract closed, I walked home through the streets of Queens. The neon lights flickered the air bit sharp, and my phone buzzed with congratulatory texts. I slipped it back into my pocket and kept walking, my thoughts louder than the city. I had climbed higher than I ever imagined, yet I carried a silence that grew heavier with each step. When I reached my apartment and shut the door, the room felt too quiet. The radiator clanked, the city hummed outside, but inside was only me and the memory of everything I had hidden. I sat at the desk, the glow of the computer screen washing over me, and let the noise of the day fall away. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to stop moving to breathe and to feel the shadow of what was still unfinished. By early 2023, Sentinel Tech was stamped across headlines that once ignored me. A valuation of 50 million, interviews with glossy magazines, photos where the lights were too bright and the questions too rehearsed. Strangers suddenly wanted to know about my journey, my resilience, the fire that kept me moving. They wrote words like visionary and survivor. But each time I saw those headlines, I felt the weight of a story that had never been told. Success had made me visible, and with visibility came shadows I had long prepared myself to face. The email arrived on a Monday morning, unsigned but unmistakable. It demanded a meeting, claimed rights, spoke of sacrifices and parental duty. The names at the bottom were Linda Walker and Mark Reynolds. My mother and the man she had chosen over me now returned, not in whispers, but in bold type. They wanted their share, not in apologies, but in dollars. I sat in my office, the skyline stretching outside the windows, and let the words sink in. For years I had imagined this moment, not if, but when. I picked up the phone and called Sarah Thompson. She answered with the calm steadiness that had anchored me since the day she gave me that receipt in Brooklyn. "They are circling," I said. "Then let them," she replied. "We have more than memory, we have proof." When the meeting came, Linda walked into the conference room as if she had never left me in an empty house with a jar of bills. Her hair was styled, her clothes chosen to impress, and her eyes scanned the room like a stage she believed belonged to her. Mark followed, heavier, his jaw set, the same swagger I remembered from the porch light of 2013. Sarah sat across from them, files neatly arranged, her voice calm as glass. "You claim parental support," she said, "but the records tell a different story." She slid documents across the table, bank statements, wire transfers, proof that the checks my father sent from Afghanistan had been siphoned away, not into my care, but into theirs. Linda's face twitched, a flicker of recognition she tried to smother. Mark shifted in his chair, his hand tightening into a fist. I stayed silent, letting Sarah's words do what my own rage never could. Each page she turned was another nail in their performance. Linda tried to interrupt, her voice rising, talking of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, but Sarah's hand on the papers silenced her more than any argument could. The confrontation spilled outside the room when Rachel Adams, a journalist who had followed Sentinel Tech since its early days, caught wind of the dispute. She approached Mark as he left the building, her recorder hidden in her palm, her questions sharp. Mark snapped, his temper spilling faster than he could contain it. He cursed about entitlement, muttered about money they had already taken, and in one careless moment confirmed everything Sarah had laid bare. By evening, Rachel's article was live, the headline crisp against the glow of my phone. "Mother and partner seek share of founder's fortune, records suggest years of diverted support." It spread faster than any press release I had ever crafted. For the first time, the town that had once forgotten me was reading about what had been stolen, not whispered, but printed. Calls poured in, some of support, some of curiosity, some from investors anxious about reputation. I answered each with a steady tone, but inside I felt a storm. I had wanted the truth to surface, but not in this theater, not under these lights. Yet there it was, no longer mine to hide. Claire called that night, her voice tight with concern. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" she asked. I paused too long, then admitted yes. She said she believed in me, that none of this changed who I was. I wanted to believe her, but I knew it did. It changed everything. The next morning I walked into the office, and every face looked at me with questions they did not ask. I sat at my desk, papers stacked, phone buzzing, and felt the line between past and present blur. My mother and Mark had returned, not with apologies but demands, and the world now watched. I leaned back, stared out at the winter light over Manhattan, and let the noise of the city fill the silence inside me. The ghosts had stepped into daylight, and for the first time in years, I did not look away. I drove back to Dayton on a gray morning, the kind where the clouds hang low enough to touch the rooftops. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, the houses leaning closer together, as if they carried the weight of every story whispered inside them. I parked outside the precinct and sat for a long time with the engine off, staring at the same brick walls that once held the man who knocked on my door in 2013. When I finally stepped inside, the lobby smelled of coffee burned too long on a hot plate. Officer Daniels was older now, heavier around the eyes, but his handshake was steady. He remembered me quicker than I expected. "You survived," he said with a half-smile, then asked what brought me back. I told him I needed a copy of the original report from the night my mother left. His brow tightened, but he nodded, disappearing into the back. While I waited, I looked at the notice board rows of missing children, lost pets, stolen cars. For a moment, I was 13 again, standing at that door, with rain dripping off the roof. Daniels returned with a manila folder. He slid it across the counter like it weighed more than paper should. "Keep it safe," he said. When I thanked him, he added quietly, "I always wondered what became of you." I tucked the folder under my arm and walked back into the chill air, feeling the past settle heavy against my ribs. On my way out of town, I stopped at a diner for coffee. That was where I saw Jason Walker, my cousin, who once looked away when I asked for help. He froze at the sight of me, then walked over, his voice low. "I was a coward back then," he said. "I should have done more." The apology hung between us like smoke. I told him I had learned to stop expecting family to save me. He nodded, eyes down, and walked out without finishing his coffee. Back in New York, the war moved to courtrooms. Linda had hired an attorney, a man with sharp suits and sharper words, claiming she was owed years of back support and a rightful stake in Sentinel Tech. They dressed their arguments in language about parental obligation, about foundation and sacrifice. Sarah sat across the table, her calm unshaken. She unfolded documents one by one, each a brick in the wall I was building higher than any tower. There was the bank record showing deposits diverted, the power of attorney she had signed over to Mark, the photographs of her on vacation in Florida, while I scraped meals from pantries. Each page spread across the polished table, until the narrative they tried to weave unraveled in plain sight. Linda's lawyer raised his voice, tried to object, but Sarah's tone never wavered. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed microphones forward. One asked if I felt guilty for refusing my own mother. I looked into the camera and said I carried the guilt of her choices long enough. Now I carried facts. That night, the headlines ran not with accusations, but with evidence. Still, the attacks did not stop. Rumors spread that I had forged documents, that I was erasing history to hoard wealth. Anonymous posts swirled online, twisting truth into poison. At times it felt like trying to hold back a tide with my bare hands. Yet each time I faltered, Sarah reminded me that walls are not built in a day. Each lawsuit, each slander was another brick, and we had mortar stronger than anger. It was during those weeks that I announced the Rose Grant, a fund for homeless teens across Ohio. I stood at a podium in Columbus, cameras flashing, and spoke of my grandmother, of her letters, of the nights she made survival feel possible. The applause was polite, the coverage modest, but I saw the shift in people's eyes. I was not just defending myself against a claim. I was writing a counterweight to the story Linda wanted the world to believe. The day after, a reporter stopped me outside my office. She asked if the Rose Grant was a weapon in my legal war. I told her it was a promise, one that outlived court filings and contracts. What I did not say was that it was also armor, something to hold on to when their lies scraped too close. At night I reread the report from Daniels. The handwriting faded but still clear. It reminded me of the boy who lied to survive, who pulled a table under a leaking roof and whispered promises to an empty house. That boy was still with me, sharper now, harder but still reaching. The cases piled up, motions and hearings stretching late into winter. My lawyers worked through weekends, their voices calm, even as the other side grew more frantic. Linda appeared at one session, her face stiff, her eyes flashing with rehearsed sorrow. I watched her from across the aisle, waiting for a flicker of the woman who once kissed the air near my forehead and left me to rot. There was nothing. When the gavel struck to end another hearing, I stepped outside into the bite of February wind. The cameras caught my face, but for once I did not flinch. The noise around me felt distant, muffled, as if I stood behind the wall I had built. A wall of truth, of paper, of silence, stronger than any shout. I walked toward the waiting car, folder under my arm, the city buzzing with a story it thought it understood. Behind me the courthouse doors closed, but ahead lay a battlefield no headline could capture. The lawsuits were only beginning, the lies only growing louder, and still I kept walking steady against the cold. The email arrived just after midnight, the subject line blank, the body written in clipped sentences that carried his voice even through the screen. Mark Reynolds demanded $250,000 in exchange for silence. He wrote of knowing things that could ruin me, of interviews he might give, of lawyers he had on speed dial. I read it twice, then, a third time, my chest tightening, not from fear, but from the stench of desperation that seeped through every word. I forwarded it to Sarah. Her reply came within minutes, short and sharp. Extortion. We turn it over. By morning, the email was in the hands of a federal prosecutor, its timestamp and headers preserved, another piece in the growing file against them. The mediation session followed 2 weeks later in a high-rise boardroom overlooking Midtown. The table was long, polished, the kind meant to impress and intimidate. Linda arrived in pearls and navy, Mark beside her with a tie that strained at his collar. Their attorney opened with practiced outrage, speaking of maternal bonds, of years of sacrifice, of a moral right to compensation. They demanded 5% of Sentinel Tech, valued at more than $2 million. I listened. My hands folded, the city skyline reflected in the glass behind them. When they finished, Sarah leaned forward. She asked if the court should consider the bank records again, the proof of diverted checks, the photographs of vacations funded by stolen support. She mentioned the extortion email, her voice calm but clear. The other side bristled, Mark shifting, Linda whispering sharply to her lawyer. They pressed again, arguing about blood and duty. But I shook my head. No percentage, no settlement. My company was not built on their absence. It was built in spite of it. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. That night, Rachel Adams called. Her tone was urgent, her words crisp. She was publishing a feature not about Sentinel Tech, but about me, the boy in the vacant house. She had gathered records, interviewed neighbors, spoken with Officer Daniels. She had pieced together the story of the nights I spent under that leaking roof, the jar of bills, the table under the drip. She asked if I wanted to comment. I said only that the record spoke louder than memory. When the article went live, the effect was immediate. The photographs of the old house, boarded windows, and overgrown lawns spread across feeds and front pages. The story of a boy abandoned became the headline, not the lawsuit. Investors called not with panic, but with support. Messages poured in from strangers, some who had known hunger, some who had known silence. For the first time, the weight of my past was not mine alone to carry. But the twist came quietly in a folder Sarah slid across my desk a week later. Among the documents we had pulled from old county archives was a signature dated 2013, supposedly from my father. It authorized my mother to act on his behalf to manage finances while he was deployed. The ink was smudged, the handwriting close but wrong. Sarah had compared it to Robert Walker's enlistment forms, his letters, even the note he left me before boarding the plane. It was not his hand. It was hers. Linda had forged my father's name while he was in Afghanistan, using his absence as cover to siphon funds and secure legal ground she never deserved. The realization settled over me like frost. It was not only abandonment, it was theft under the mask of duty betrayal sharpened with intention. I sat in the quiet of my office, the city humming beyond the glass, and stared at the signature that had never been his. Every line of it was another night of hunger, another lie, another brick in the wall I had built. The battlefield was no longer memory or courtroom alone. It was here in boardrooms and archives and signatures twisted into weapons. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "We will use it." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting mine. This was not only defense anymore, it was offense, the kind that could end their claims before they ever reached another table. I folded the page, slid it back into the folder, and placed it on the corner of my desk. Outside, the lights of Manhattan burned higher than towers, but inside, I felt the ground harden beneath me. The war had changed shape, and I was ready for the next strike. The call came on a Sunday morning, a voice I had not heard in a decade, carrying a weight that froze me in place. Robert Walker. My father was back in Dayton. He said my name slowly, like testing it against the silence he had carried across continents. I told him to meet me at the diner near 3rd Street, the one with chipped booths and coffee that tasted like burnt wood. When I walked in, he was already there, a man weathered by desert sun and sleepless years, shoulders still squared by discipline, but eyes shadowed by something raw. He stood awkwardly, then reached for my hand, hesitating as if unsure he deserved to touch me. I let him. We sat across from each other, the waitress pouring coffee. Neither of us drank. He started with apologies, words that came out brittle. He said he believed Linda's letters, that they told him I was safe living with her, cared for. He reached into his jacket and unfolded one, the paper yellowed at the edges. It was written in her hand, signed with my name at the bottom, telling him not to worry, telling him I was fine. My stomach clenched. It was the final proof that her betrayal was not just absence, but construction, a lie designed to ease his conscience and keep him fighting while she siphoned money from his sacrifice. I told him what really happened. The nights in the vacant house, the jar of bills, the police report, the food from pantries. His face crumpled, a soldier who had faced fire now breaking under the weight of his own blindness. He whispered that he chose war over family, that he thought duty meant distance, and now all he had left was regret. His hands shook as he pressed the letter across the table, as if giving me a weapon forged from his shame. He confessed he could not sleep without hearing the rattle of gunfire, that he woke in the night, ready to strike. His body sat in Dayton, but his mind still crouched behind walls in Kandahar. I listened as he admitted he did not know how to be here, how to stand in a grocery aisle without scanning for exits. The diner around us, blurred, voices muffled, until it was just a father and son at a table heavy with ghosts. When Linda walked in later that week for a forced family meeting arranged by attorneys, Robert's jaw tightened. She smiled like nothing was broken, spoke of misunderstandings and chances to repair. He cut her off. He told her he had the letters, that he knew what she had done. For the first time, I saw him choose me instead of her. His voice rose not in rage, but in something closer to grief. She flinched but held her mask, insisting she had done what she must. Robert looked at me, then at Sarah sitting beside me, and said he would testify. He would tell the court how she wrote those lies, how she stole what was meant for survival, how she fed him stories while feeding herself vacations and comfort. It was not redemption, not fully. He admitted he had failed by leaving in the first place, by trusting too easily, by wanting to believe comfort instead of truth. But he would stand now, even if his hands shook, even if the flash of cameras made him reach for weapons no longer there. That night I drove him back to the motel where he stayed. He stared out the window, the lights of Dayton flickering against glass, his reflection lined with years of absence. He said he did not know how to be a father anymore, that he feared I would never forgive him. I told him forgiveness was not the point. Truth was. He nodded slowly, gripping the edge of his seat like it might carry him through another firefight. When I left him at the door, he looked smaller than I remembered, a man stripped of armor, holding only regret and a fragile promise to stand beside me at last. I watched him disappear into the dim hall, the letter in my pocket heavier than any weapon. The case was shifting again, and now I had a witness whose silence had once cost me everything. The battlefield ahead was still cold and merciless, but for the first time, the war carried another voice beside mine. The courthouse in downtown Dayton rose against the gray winter sky, its steps slick with ice and the weight of every foot that had climbed them before mine. Inside, the air was dry, carrying the faint smell of paper and varnish. Linda sat across the aisle in a tailored navy suit, her hair carefully arranged, her eyes scanning the gallery as if she were the victim. Mark adjusted his tie, leaning close to whisper something that made her lips tighten into a practiced smile. The judge entered, the gavel fell, and the trial began. Their attorney painted a picture of sacrifice, of a mother holding a broken household together while her husband was at war and her son ungrateful. They spoke of hardship, of years spent scraping by, of sacrifices no one else could understand. Linda dabbed her eyes with a tissue. At the perfect moment, Mark clasped her hand like a dutiful partner, and for a second, the room tilted as if truth were losing ground. Sarah stood, her voice steady, her presence sharp against their performance. She began with documents, laying them out in careful sequence. Bank statements from 2013 to 2017 showing the steady drain of Robert's military allotments into Linda's account. Receipts from Florida resorts and photographs time-stamped with the very weeks the money had arrived. The jury leaned forward. Then came the handwriting expert. A stack of Linda's letters was compared to the letter Robert had carried from Kandahar, the one assuring him I was safe. The expert's pointer traced curves and slants, explaining how the signature under my name was a forgery, the stroke too heavy, the spacing inconsistent. The truth cut through the theater like glass. Mark's composure cracked first. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted his body, leaning back as if retreating. The prosecutor, having watched in silence, finally moved. He announced that based on the forged documents and the misappropriation of military funds, a criminal investigation into Mark Reynolds was now open. The ripple through the courtroom was immediate, a low murmur silenced only by the judge's gavel. When it was Robert's turn to testify, he rose slowly, each step measured, his hand brushing the rail for balance. His voice was hoarse, not from weakness, but from battles lived too long in silence. He confirmed the exact amount of his allotments, $9,600 over 4 years, money meant to sustain me. Money that vanished into Linda's vacations and comforts. His eyes did not leave hers as he spoke, and for the first time, I saw her face pale under the weight of a truth she could not bend. Their lawyer tried to salvage spinning stories about confusion, about clerical errors, about a woman overwhelmed by circumstance. But the letter spoke louder, the bank records louder still, and Robert's trembling hand holding the forged paper became the nail sealing their coffin. The judge leaned back, his expression hard. He declared Linda's petition denied in full, her claims without merit. He ruled that the forged documents and supporting evidence would be forwarded to the prosecutor's office for criminal review. The gavel struck final and unyielding, and in that sound I heard something close to release. As the courtroom emptied, Linda reached for me. Her hand hovered near my sleeve, her voice breaking as she whispered my name. I stepped back, my body cold, but my voice sharper than I expected. "You abandoned a child," I said. The words landed between us like iron. Her fingers curled back, her face tightening into something that looked more like pride than shame, and she turned away. I walked out with Sarah on one side and Robert on the other. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashed the air outside, biting against my skin. The fight was not finished, not yet, but in that moment the scales had shifted, and for once the weight was no longer crushing me. The headlines faded as quickly as they had come, but the damage lingered where it mattered most. Linda lost her job at the insurance office in Columbus within a week of the verdict, her supervisor citing dishonesty and reputational harm. Neighbors turned their heads when she walked past the church she once attended, quietly closed its doors to her. Mark faced more than whispers. The prosecutor's office announced an ongoing investigation into fraud and forgery, and subpoenas began arriving at his apartment door. For the first time, they were the ones shrinking from the light. I chose not to press further with civil claims. It was not mercy, it was choice. To drag the fight longer would keep me chained to them, to the house they left me in, to the boy who slept under a leaking roof. Instead, I directed my energy somewhere else. Sentinel Tech had become stable, not only profitable, but secure. And for the first time, I had resources that stretched beyond survival. That fall, I founded the Rose Grant, named for the woman who kept me alive when the rest of the world forgot. It began modestly, a program offering housing stipends and legal aid to homeless teens in Dayton. Officer Daniels accepted my invitation to the opening ceremony. When I handed him the framed photograph of Rose to hang in the office lobby, his hands shook as he adjusted it on the wall. He had seen her kindness long before I had the words to describe it. Claire stood beside me at the event, her fingers brushing mine as she listened to the stories of the kids we aimed to help. That night, when the last of the speeches ended, I told her everything. I told her about the note and the $40, the cold nights under a broken ceiling, the letters forged to keep my father in the dark, the years of silence that shaped me. She did not flinch or pull away. She listened, her eyes steady, her voice soft, as she said she was not leaving. For the first time, my story was not a weight I carried alone. Weeks later, I returned to Dayton. The house on Willow Street stood tired, the paint peeling, the roof line still sagging where rain had once dripped onto my bed. I signed the deed and walked through the empty rooms, each corner, holding an echo of the boy who had lived there. Contractors fixed the roof, patched the plaster, replaced the broken windows. When the last nail was hammered, I placed Rose's tin box on the rebuilt shelf. Her letters rested there, no longer hidden, no longer damp with rot, but upright in the open air. Robert visited soon after. He was older now, his gait slower, his eyes carrying battles that had never left Afghanistan. We sat on the porch steps, the same place where I had once watched Linda drive away. He held out a small box and pressed it into my hands. Inside lay his unit insignia, worn from years of service, the metal edges dulled. He said it was the only thing he had never given away, and that it should belong to me. His voice broke when he said it was a poor trade for lost years, but it was all he had to offer. I took it not as a payment, not as repair, but as acknowledgement. The leaves turned that October, scattering gold across the yard. I stood on the porch as dusk settled the roof above me, whole again, the house no longer abandoned, but claimed. My voice in that silence was clear. I had not avenged myself with blood. I had avenged with truth, and I chose to live. If this story has found a place in you, stay with me here. There are more journeys of justice and dignity, waiting, more voices long silenced that deserve to be heard.